welcome to the London School of Economics and Political Science for the next in our 2020 Visions series, Conversations on the Future of Democracy. My name is Megan Palmer. I manage the LSE Ideas Central and Southeast Europe programme, and I'll be chairing this conversation on geopolitics in the Balkans. This event is being recorded and will be made available as a podcast subject to technical tests. As usual, there will be the chance for you to put questions to our panellists. Please could you use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit questions throughout the event, and I'll pose as many as possible to the speakers. If your question is for a particular panellist, please indicate this in the Q&A section. And now I'm delighted to introduce our four panellists. First, we have Bogdan Zawadewicz, who is an LSE associate and PhD candidate in political science at the Ludwig Maximilians University of Munich. We are also joined from Belgrade by Sena Marić from the European Policy Centre. We're joined by Maxim Samorukov, who is a fellow at the Carnegie Institute, Moscow. And finally, we're joined by Yu Jie, who is an LSE Ideas Associate and Senior Research Fellow on China in the Asia Pacific Programme at Chatham House in London. To start off our discussion on the situation in the Balkans right now, I'd like to ask Bogdan if he could give us his interpretation of the situation that we see today. Bogdan, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As you all can see, today we're going to discuss the topic of geopolitical dynamics in the Balkans. I'm going to make a very brief introduction to our discussion and present our argument on the involvement of external powers in the region of the Balkans. Just a sec, I will change the slide. Sorry, just got, okay, have some problems with that. Sorry, it goes from, I guess my application got frozen, but, oh yeah, here, all right. So first, I will try to briefly discuss the Serbian foreign policy, try to describe it and understand it. The Serbian foreign policy refers directly to the country's position within the global hierarchies. As many of you probably know, Serbia is neither a EU or NATO member state. However, it's the largest country in the Western Balkans. So in order to understand this, the country's foreign policy, I also employ the concept of multi-interface periphery, the concept which originates from academic research. And an example of the country that has the ability of being a multi-interface periphery is Ireland. Ireland that for the last 3 decades has been trying to balance between different core countries, between different centers of power. So one of the main features of multi-interface periphery is the country's ability to open up to more than 2 core centers, core countries. So I said in case of Ireland was US, UK, and the EU, and Ireland was trying to play one country, one center against the other in order to extract as many resources as possible for itself. So for instance, Ireland used the EU membership in order to attract the foreign direct investment from the US, and use the US in order to somehow neutralize the power of UK in their negotiations on the future of Northern Ireland, and so on. So as I said, Ireland is a good example of the multi-interface periphery, the country that somehow moved up from the typical peripheral state or transformed into the multi-interface periphery. So our question is, what kind of geopolitical entity is Serbia today? So in popular knowledge or in popular public discourses, Serbia is often presented as a country that balance between different powers, and thanks to that, it's able to something for itself. So I would argue that that actually, if you look at the reality on the ground, I would argue that Serbia or Serbian foreign policy is actually a failed attempt to become a multi-interface periphery. That in case of Serbia concerns the balance or the policy and the balance between the US, EU, Russia, and China. Serbian government has managed to build up the image of Serbia as a self-confident actor with a very strong sense of agency. And this was mainly due to the fact that there are two sensitive issues, that is Kosovo and Republika Srpska, that somehow in both cases Serbia is involved in resolving this the status of both entities. Both the same case of Republika Srpska is a part of the an entity that is a part of Bosnia, and in case of Kosovo is a sort of independent state. So relying on this situation, this political situation, and Serbia's involvement in both places, that is Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo, the country tries to maintain such image of itself. However, I would argue that in reality, due to the lack of economic capital and very low institutional capacities, and because of relying on non-Western countries, Serbia actually is a typical peripheral or semi-peripheral country. It's certainly not the multi-interface periphery as it is presented in popular knowledge. My second main argument is that it is the EU that actually acts or operates as a hegemonic structure in the region, as a structure that provides a transnational integration regime that has been accepted by all states in the region. So this relies on the fact that there's a very high level of structural dependency, or Serbia's structural dependency on the EU, and in broader sense on the West. And there are several aspects of this dependency. The first aspect refers to the legal and institutional harmonization, the institutional convergence. This process has started with the implementation of the association agreement with the EU, and with the start of the negotiation talks between Belgrade and Brussels on the EU accession. And this harmonization provides a legal framework that has been implemented, or has been implemented by the local government, with all its economic and political implications. So basically, it is the EU that defines the rules of the game that concern the economic relations, trade relations, and so on. Another feature of this, another dimension of this dependency refers to the debt and the financial dependency. So if you look at the statistics, the biggest providers of loans of loans to Serbian government are the Western organizations such as the European Investment Bank, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and commercial banks. And this also contributes to that structural dependency. And another factor that is related to this is the foreign direct investments. If you look at the numbers, the vast majority of foreign direct investments come from the Western countries. The third feature is the fact that state building processes in this region are mainly driven by the Western actors. If you look at Kosovo or Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's quite obvious, like the institutions and the institutional capacities are established by the Western actors, which also confirms the argument on the EU hegemonic position in the region. And then there is the dimension that has the direct influence on domestic politics. So here we have Western structures which serve as a sort of source of political symbolic legitimization for local government. In case of Serbia, it's President of Serbia Vučić and his party, Serbian Progressive Party, SNS, that relies to a very large extent on the support, either political or symbolic, that they receive from the Western structures. The last aspect of this dependency refers to the military cooperation between Serbia and Western actors. We have in 2015, Serbia signed the Individual Partnership Action Plan with NATO, along with together with the program for peace, it also somehow imposes certain rules in the military sector on Serbia. Serbia has been implementing those rules. So this is the one thing. Another is that if you look at the number of military exercises between NATO and Serbia, it's much higher than for instance, the number of military exercises Serbian Russian military exercises. So these are the main characteristics of the Western hegemony in the region. So concerning the non-Western actors in the Balkans, I would argue that since 2014-15, since the outbreak with the conflict in Ukraine, Russia has been experiencing a geopolitical retreat from Europe, which, along with the hegemonic position of the EU in the region, imposes a significant limit or constraints on Russia's capacities and possibilities in the region. However, also argue that there is much more space, comparing to Serbia, there's much more space for Russian influence in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and this is due to the fact that, first of all, Russia is one of the, has some significant impact on the political system in Bosnia. Currently, there's an ongoing debate on the future of political system in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and due to the veto power, Russia, due to the veto power in the Security Council, but also due to the fact that Russia is one of the countries that guarantees the Dayton agreements, it has some leverage, right? And additionally, we already had such cases in the past where Russia, when there was voting in the UN Security Council on the, let's say, Srebrenica resolution or the report that is provided by the High Representative from Bosnia and Herzegovina to the UN, blocked both things. So it's in perception in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Republika Srpska, as recently President of Republika Srpska stated, Russia is not only perceived as a country that represents the Serbian interest in the Security Council, but actually presents Serbian nation. There's a kind of interesting distinction between these two things. So this brings us to the scope of activities that are available to Russians. And I would argue that Russians, most of the activities are focused on the intelligence. So that is the information gathering, recruiting the individuals, and so on. Basically, the final, ultimate goal is to capture the security sector. Interestingly, we have the individuals working in security sector in both Republika Srpska and Serbia who are quite loyal to Russia, mainly because they perceive their own government, mainly the Belgrade government, as betraying Serbian interests. This is one of the motivation, and others is probably the economic one. Also, interestingly, we have the case of South Stream. This is the Russian-run gas pipeline that goes through Turkey, Bulgaria, Serbia, Hungary. Probably there will be some extension to Republika Srpska. And because the gas pipeline goes through the EU member states, with the territory of EU member states, it has to stick to the EU internal market rules, which actually prevent Russia from using this gas pipeline as a sort of tool to put some political pressure on local government. Concerning China, very briefly, well, China is mostly involved in development projects by providing cheap loans to local governments. In Serbia, they have provided financing for some road and rail infrastructure projects. And interestingly, there's a project, but I would say that those projects are not as beneficial to Serbia as one may think. The good example is the railway connection between Belgrade and Budapest, which is a part of the bigger rail connection between Piraeus and Budapest. It's funded by the Chinese. However, it could be described as a white elephant for Serbia. I mean, the investment that probably won't be profitable for the country, but is profitable or beneficial for China. And the same with 5G and Huawei involvement in the region. I would argue that I conducted several interviews with the people, with the members of political elites in Belgrade and Banja Luka, and I had the impression that they of course, are trying to be. I mean, Chinese try to convince them to accept their offer to build a 5G infrastructure. However, it depends to a very large extent on the decision that will be made somewhere else. In this case, in Brussels or Berlin. However, also I identified quite strong Chinese influence, or the Chinese efforts aimed at influencing the elites, mainly in Republika Srpska. They often invite them to come to China. There's cooperation with certain certain local state agencies. Chinese are actually developing also cooperation with the Faculty of Security Studies in Banja Luka, which is directly connected to the police academy. But yeah, so anyway, thank you for your attention, and I hope that now I would like to ask my colleagues to continue our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Bogdan. That was a really wonderful overview of the many very, very complicated issues affecting the region right now. And so to expand on that and to drill down a little more into the role of the European Union in the Balkans, I'd like to hand the floor to Sena, who will give us her overview of the EU's role. Sena.
Thank you, Megan. Well, before observing the Western Balkans in general, I understand Bogdan's introduction of addressing Serbia specifically as the biggest and the most, let's say, influential country in the region. So developments in Serbia, all the region depends, let's say, on the developments on Serbia, and that's why it's important to observe Serbia in greater detail. Talking in general about the Western Balkans, these countries have been engaged in EU integration process since 20 years now. And as the time passed, their accession roads, let's say, differentiated to a great extent. So nowadays you have 3 groups of countries, let's say, on different, really different stages of EU accession or integration process. First and foremost, you have Montenegro and Serbia as formally the most advanced countries, especially Montenegro, which opened all negotiating chapters, but paradoxically, who have been regressing and backsliding in democratic performance, in media freedoms, in the rule of law in general, according to all renowned independent indices for years now, like Freedom House, PTI, VDEM, Economic, The Economist, Intelligence Unit, and so on and so forth. Then you have North Macedonia and Albania, which are hopefully starting accession negotiations soon. At least it was agreed that this move would happen in a foreseeable future. And then in the end, you have Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo with unresolved statehood issues, with many problems in terms of being fully functional states, and which seem to be neglected by the international community as a whole, as if the current status quo seemed to be fit for everyone. So in such a situation, it seems that the EU is losing its transformative power or leverage, which used to have, I would say, the first decade from, let's say, 2000 to 2010. And you can just recall, for example, the visa liberalization process, which has seen 5 Western Balkan countries, one except Kosovo, being able to travel to Schengen zone freely, where the political elites were really investing themselves and motivated to pursue the necessary reforms in order to have this achievement, because they saw it as a big, politically lucrative investment, let's say, which was motivating to deliver. In the last 10 days, we have seen the increase, or let's say the consolidation of state capture mechanisms in these countries, where a very sophisticated and expanded system of clientelistic networks has been created, which is now very difficult to dismantle. But that's why you have more or less formally advancement of at least 4 countries of the region on EU accession road, but in terms of rule of law and democracy, you have the backsliding, and that's now, I think, the greatest concern the EU needs to face now, like the EU enlargement policy in general. And the region itself, this is where the EU's enlargement policy interlaces with its common foreign and security policy. So far, it has been able to capitalize on the EU membership perspective for the sake of foreign policy, let's say, wins, such as the Brussels Agreement in 2013, brokered by former High Commissioner Catherine Ashton, who has said that it was one of the major achievements of that European Commission. Or any other, foreign policy initiative is always linked to offering some tangible EU membership perspective rewards. But this is no longer the case. There is no, at least from the region's view, genuine membership willingness from the EU side to accept these countries to the EU. And this is where lies the greatest challenge and the greatest opportunity of the EU if it wants to become a greater and more autonomous geopolitical actor, which is the ambition of the current European Commission, as you probably know. So on the one side, you have many different member states, different national interests when it comes to the enlargement policy. So ones are more reluctant than the others for their own geographical position and national interest. We could talk about that if that's the case. And this is in a way preventing the EU from being more politically active and to provide this greater political steering to this process. This is probably also, when we talk about the opportunities, we can maybe discuss it also later, but this somehow comes now naturally to say. The EU's necessity to reduce its economic dependence from other countries, especially from China, and to reduce the supply chains and so on, calls it for greater economic and political investment in the Western Balkans. So if it sees this moment of Corona context as an opportunity, I think it can really also capitalize on being more stronger and a more visible geopolitical actor in the region and be more influential, for example, when it comes to the resolution of Belgrade-Pristina, or let's say Serbia-Kosovo recognition, and being more active actor in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and so on and so forth. The recent blow of the Trump administration to broker a deal last weekend in Washington also is in a way a recognition that there are no quick fixes in the Western Balkans, that all the remaining unresolved bilateral disputes do take time and do take more complex approach. And this in a way gives a chance for the EU to position itself as a stronger political actor. I see that my 6 minutes have elapsed, but we can, if there are any other questions, we can maybe address them or open them later in the conversation stage.
Wonderful, thank you, Sena. So I'm just going to move the conversation straight onwards to the next region that we are likely discuss in great detail in the discussion. So I'd like to invite Maxim to take the floor and give his perspective on the Russian experience in the Balkans.
Hello. I'll try to explain how recent events in the Balkans, especially the Serbian elections, which took place like 1 week ago, affected Russia's position in the region. Like, the short answer is negatively. Actually, it even further undermines Russia's position in the Balkans, which is already quite weak. Ostensibly, everything looks perfect. This was the least democratic elections in Serbia since the fall of the communism, and the Kremlin seems to be happy about that. Kremlin's favorite ally, Vučić, has gained full control of the parliament. There is zero threat that any liberal pro-Western opposition comes to power in Serbia. The Lavrov was in Belgrade with his first post-pandemic visit. Vučić was the only foreign leader outside post-Soviet space who visited Moscow's victory parade. Both countries are adamant that they are in full agreement on Kosovo. Those relations seem perfect, but the underlying reality of these relations are quite gloomy for Moscow. because the Kremlin would never recognize that because of its visceral dislike of democracy. But in fact, based on our past experience, it's quite clear that the more democratic is Serbia, the more beneficial it is for Russia. The stronger is the rivalry between Serbian politicians, the greater leverage Russia has in the country. And the reason for that is quite simple. Just because one of the key Russia's assets in Serbia is pro-Russian public opinion, and public opinion matters only in a democracy. It doesn't really matter in an autocracy like in Serbia under Vučić, where it can easily be manipulated. And if we look at Russia's past achievements in relation in Serbia, all of them were made during the years when Serbian political life was quite competitive. Like if we take the acquisition of oil giant NIS, or the railroad modernization project, or the opening of humanitarian center in Niš, all this was done during the times when Serbian politicians were competing with each other acutely, and they were striving for Russia's favor and were ready to offer something in exchange. After Vučić came to power, the relations just degraded to symbolic, high-profile gestures which lack any substance. Now domestically, Vučić can portray himself as pro-Russian without giving Moscow much in return. After the recent elections, Vučić's control over Serbian political life has increased even further, and he will even less depend on Russia's support. He will need to make even fewer steps, even fewer concessions to Moscow to gain Moscow's support. And Moscow has to continue supporting him just because it has no alternative. All other opposition parties are marginalized. Moscow has lost all the contacts with parties which also used to be pro-Russian in Serbia. All pro-Russian structures in Serbia, they do exist, but Vučić has greater control over them than the Kremlin does. Even if we take like the notorious Sputnik Serbia, which is financed directly from Russian state budget, in its actions, in reality, on the ground, it far more depends on Vučić's favor. It fears Vučić than the Kremlin. And now, after the Vučić spectacular victory, the Kosovo issue is again on the table. And this is one of the key trump cards in Moscow, Russia's trump cards in the Balkans. And of course, Russia doesn't want this conflict to be resolved, but it can do little to undermine the resolution just because it lacks the local infrastructure. All the infrastructure Russia has in the region is far more dependent on Vučić. And it means that sooner or later, the Kremlin will have to accept the Vučić decision on Kosovo, irrespectively of its own position. And after Kosovo is done, and if it's done, Russia will have little to offer to the countries in the region. Of course, it doesn't mean that Russia will disappear altogether from the Balkan politics, but its dependence on Vučić's favor will grow even stronger. And it will be present in the region, but only to the extent Vučić is ready to allow that. And looking at past experience, we see that Vučić is quite capable of playing both sides. He can portray himself as a strong ally of Kremlin, but at the same time, he is very eager to play the Russian threat card with the West. And Moscow will have to tolerate, as it has already tolerated, such gestures on the Vučić side, and it will be even more inclined to do the same in future. I think I can stop here.
Okay, great. Thank you, Maxim. I'm sure we're going to pick up on a number of things that you've mentioned there. There's an awful lot to talk about. But I'm going to proceed and hand over to Cherry, if I may use your anglicized name, to give us a perspective on China's involvement in the Balkans.
Thank you, Megan, so much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so delighted to return to LSE Ideas and provide some of my thoughts regarding China's engagement within the Balkan region, but also China-EU relations in general. But let me really thank my my former colleague, Professor Christopher Coker, and also Ratu Family Charitable Foundation here to supporting this entire initiative for LSE Ideas. And I'm delighted to see the entire thing has been taken off for now. Now, come back to the key question. I mean, I've heard several previous speakers has already mentioned, you know, China's engagement within Serbia and also within the Western Balkan regions. I think this is not really much differences between China's engagement with many other developing countries in general. But what really make the entire thing become far trickier is the long-standing this sense of like EU accession scheme with Serbia, but also on the complication of EU-China relations in general. So as far as we know, I mean, the European Union in the past few years really felt like showed very little interest in terms of involving itself in the global power struggle between Beijing and Washington. And I think the majority of European government also have taken nuanced view that China challenge. Many really share the United States' concern on the direction of China to travel and the President Xi Jinping, and particularly in this relation to domestic market access and also unfair competition from state-owned enterprises and state-backed companies, as you can see so pervasively in Serbia. But there's also internal divisions on China, on how European Union should deal with China and speaking with one voice. And I think somehow Serbia has really become a test ground for China's ideas in terms of the global governance and also in terms of how the EU-China relations should be conducted. Now, just not to, even if Serbia or Western Balkans in general is not really part of the EU as such yet, I think what the European Union in general was worried about, that fear the impact of the rise of China could definitely challenge the democratic governance form and also the rule of law of the EU bloc, which has been established in the past 70 years or so. But China has been very clear in terms of engaging with the European Union and also engage with Serbia in general. I mean, the whole idea is firstly, the European market remains extremely attractive to the Chinese companies and the government. And in the eyes of many Chinese investors, the European Union representing a very much a secure home for the investment, and this also including Serbia as well. I mean, I even actually noticed that Serbia Football League have a substantial Chinese influence in it, and as you can imagine. So in particular, China would really prefer to engage with European Union and also to engage with Western Balkans because of its growing appetite for the overseas asset acquisitions and also for greenfield investment. And I've noticed the number that from 2012 alone, Serbia apparently received more than $9.5 billion in terms of financing and in terms of investment, and more than half of what China has announced investment within the region of the Western Balkan. So China treating Serbia and in Western Balkan in general as an economic target. And secondly, and I think this even happened before COVID-19, Beijing found itself fighting an economic slowdown and also this enduring trade war with the United States as China's most important economic and strategic partner, but also strategic rival as well. These two difficulties really are intrinsically intertwined. So having a sluggish economic growth domestically inside China, but also on the other hand, having a trade war at the same time with the United States. So China is actually looking as many economic partners as possible. And obviously European Union is that the intended partner China want to make. And also obviously Serbia and Western Balkan regions as well. Now, thirdly, this also come to the diplomacy level. Beijing is quite eager to be recognized by the established economies, such as European Union, but also Western Balkan countries as well, to endorse its global ambition. So as to the Belt and Road Initiative, obviously Serbia played a significant role in here and has been one of the major recipients for China's Belt and Road Initiative. And also obviously because each different European member states have a different views on this Belt and Road Initiative, and therefore this really caused anxiety within the EU. At the end of the day, it seems to be the unity of the Union, it is already rather fragile, but because of China's Belt and Road Initiative, because of China being able to offer much cheaper foreign assistance and foreign loans towards the recipient countries, and therefore making the European Union perhaps less attractive in the eyes of Southern European countries, and this including Italy, Greece, but also Serbia and many other non-EU member states as well. So this entire 17+1 initiative, including Serbia and including Greece, and this really raised eyebrows in Brussels. And of course, Brussels would not tolerate for a second regarding the way how the Chinese dealt with the investment over here. But actually, at the end of the day, what I've realized is perhaps European Union have these key ideas while engaging with former communist blocs, like the former Eastern blocs, and the way how they approach is to introducing global governance and introducing rule of law in order to induce further economic developments, which is very different from the way how Chinese engage with the recipient countries of the Belt and Road Initiative. And also this is a very different way of China approaching global governance in general. China's approaches towards global governance is rather unique. And firstly, it is very much based on economic inducement, economic development, and secondly, combined with technology innovation. So digitalization of whatever digital infrastructure platforms trying to establish. So one of the previous speakers managed to discuss the role of Huawei have played in Serbia and how that's going to pan out. It remains really to be seen. So overall, at the end of the day, what we felt is this Western Balkans has now become a testing ground for China's global governance, firstly, and secondly, because of that very special status that certain Western Balkan members would like to join the European Union, and that really make Brussels felt, it seems to be China posing a very much important standard threat. I mean, what I mean by standard is the democratic standard, is the good governance standard from China, and challenge the European Union. So that's where we are. But I mean, really to go forward, can European Union really regain the popularity or regain the trust from the population in Serbia? I'm not sure. I mean, actually, I read some numbers recently. I just found out, and there was in the post-COVID-19 world, and in Serbia, one of the non-governmental organizations has conducted a survey. Apparently, 20% of the total Serbian population believe that China is the largest foreign assistant contributor to Serbia, but actually the reality, it is European Union. So how European Union will be able to travel this perception on the ground towards the Serbian population on the one hand, whereas on the other hand, really translated to make the Serbian population felt that Europe, being part of the European Union, would actually economically, but also politically, longer term benefit Serbia, and that's another question. So I think what we are now in here, it is a competition of a narrative on China and EU. So at the end of the day, if we're talking about moving out of supply chain, if we're talking about industrial repatriation, I'm afraid that really requires a lot of money. And for this very moment, and I don't think European Union on the one hand would have sufficient economic stimulus package to save the economy, whereas on the other hand, and issuing sufficient industrial policy to repatriate the industry and cut off the supply chain from China. So it's an ambivalent picture in here, and let's perhaps discuss the role of the United States within the region later. So I ended in here and looking forward to hear your disagreement and questions.
Wonderful, thank you, Cherry. Now, I have quite a few questions of my own, but I'm aware that we're already receiving a lot of questions, and I want to make sure the audience's questions are prioritized over my own. And so I'm going to go straight into the questions, and the first one is directed towards Sena. So the question comes from Clay Cash from NATO, and he asks, anyone in the panel, so please jump in, everyone else, if you have a contribution. Does anyone see genuine political will from the political elites in the Balkans to actually make the rule of law reforms necessary for EU accession? So he points out to do so would increase accountability and transparency and perhaps undermine their power. So I'll direct that question first to Sena. What's your thoughts on genuine political will to conform to the EU's requirements?
Mm-hmm. Well, sorry, what's the word? The attendant has already responded, I think, to the question. No, in the current circumstances, no one has any interest of dismantling the existing structures and to really embark on transformation which is required for achieving the European standards in terms of rule of law and democracy. And as long as this is the case, I think the countries would just, continuing backsliding in this sense. That is why I think the whole, one of the reasons why the EU has recently initiated the revision of the current accession framework of the rules of procedure, let's say, of how the countries accede to the European Union by at least for now announcing more political steering of the process and more political incentives for the Western Balkan leaders to embark on these politically costly reforms. Because absolutely, at the moment when there's no membership perspective in the foresight ahead of, let's say, 4 years of how much one politician's political mandate lasts, no one would ever, dare to, lose their position, which is now lucrative in the moment. So what we are as think tank also suggesting when we discuss this issue with how to get out of the current stalemate is to make tangible benefits for the current political elites more visible during the accession process to fit in within the 4-year political mandate of one political mandate of one government. In that case, the political elites, the ruling political elites, would be more motivated to start these reforms. And if you have, it doesn't need to be membership, but something clear and tangible and beneficial for the citizens, which they could offer back, once they are, evaluating their governmental results within 4 years, as it was the case with the mentioned visa liberalization. That could be one of the way out of the current situation, which is extremely, really worrisome in terms of rule of law and democratic performance.
Thank you. And I'd like to pass that question over to Bogdan as well, but particularly with in mind the recent events that have been going on in Serbia, and particularly the parliamentary elections and the indictment for war crimes by the president of Kosovo. I wonder if you could give us a perspective on what you think perhaps the more recent events might say to that question.
Well, as it was discussed before, we could observe in recent years, a really huge decline when it comes to rule of law and democracy, especially in Serbia, also in other Balkan countries. Well, I have a bit more sociological approach to this issue. So I think there's also some, if you look at the local elites, and especially local intelligentsia that partly supports the current regime in Serbia, I think there is a way of thinking that, a way the perception of the situation that it's not the right moment to actually focus on the rule of law and democracy, because there are more striking, more important issues such as Kosovo, right? So there, I think that part of the elite is able to somehow sacrifice these two issues, the democratic standards and so on, because of Kosovo and the government. And so basically, they perceive the current government as the only actor, reliable actor in Serbian politics that is able to somehow deal with this deadlock and ultimately finally solve this problem of Kosovo. And only afterwards, they believe that we can get back to this issue of rule of law and democracy. So I think this is one of the explanations. I personally have absolutely no trust in the current government. Well, we can speak about this more. I also think that faith in this perception of the government by the elites is quite wrong, because what we can observe today in Serbia, especially after this accelerated consolidation of power by the ruling party, is that they managed over last couple of years to build up a sort of chronic system which would be described as a chronic capitalism. So they not only control the sphere of public debate by controlling media, but also they colonialize the economic structure on the ground. I mean, the part of the structures that that the local elites have access to. So it will be extremely difficult to reverse the situation, even if they lose the power, political power. They will keep this economic resources, and this is something that many people are not aware of or do not realize. And I perceive this as the structural factor that that may play a significant role in the future. And I'm personally also quite optimistic about this democratic reforms in Serbia, or the possibility to introduce properly the rule of law. However, there might be some leverage that is coming from the EU, but that's not the case at the moment. The EU also has this very geopolitical or the realpolitik approach. It's solely focused on the solving or concentrate on solving this Kosovo issue, and that's why it supports the government. Because also we have to look at the nature of the ruling party, that it basically covers or manages all sectors of political spectrum in Serbia. So basically, you have people with leftist, rightist, conservative, anti-pro-European views, which can all find their place in this party. So that's also one of the reasons why the opposition is so weak in Serbia. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to a question we've received from Ekaterina Dimitrova, who has asked, or do you think the Balkans could become the epicenter of great power politics between the US, China, and Russia? And also, what will the US's diminishing global engagement and commitment to NATO mean for Balkan allies? Can that vacuum be filled by China and Russia? So I think I'd like to ask Maxim if you could come in on that particular question. Oh, Maxim, you're muted, I'm afraid.
Sorry, yeah. To make it short, no, it can't. I don't see how it's possible, just because Western Balkans is the third-rate priority in Russian foreign policy. Russia, despite all its activities in the region, it doesn't perceive this region as part of Russia's sphere of influence. Russian government, Russian leadership still perceives the world as like number of sphere of influences, and Balkans are not among the Russian ones. It's still the part of the West for Russia, wider West. So Russia is not really ready to invest any financial or security resources in the region. It may use it like to leverage its position in the relations with the West, but not. It has no plans to drag Western Balkan countries into Russian-dominated structures like Eurasian Economic Union or this collective security treaty which Russia leads in the post-Soviet space. It's too far away. It's already isolated from Russian borders by other countries of NATO. These countries will not increase NATO's military capacity. And actually, the only thing Russia worries about in the Balkans is an expansion of NATO, but not because it's afraid of North Macedonia or Montenegro joining NATO, but because Russia fears that once NATO's expansion starts in the Balkans, it will continue somewhere else like Ukraine, Georgia, or Moldova, all countries which are really important for Russia. So it's a region where Russia has little to lose, but has some geopolitical influence, and it tries to capitalize on its geopolitical influence to stop West far away from the countries in the Balkans, far away from the countries of the post-Soviet space, which are really important for Russia.
Thank you. And I think Cherry wanted to add her perspective on this. Cherry.
So just adding this something regarding, it seems like the Western commentators perceive that China is ready to jump on any vacuum left, this retreat of the United States. But actually, if you look really into the reality of the Chinese economy and also Chinese society in general after the COVID-19 scenario, I think what we would expect in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative and also in terms of China's foreign direct investment, we are going to expect expect much scale back, a major scale back from Beijing and also from the state-owned enterprises. Because at the end of the day, the Belt and Road Initiative has been running high and low in the last 7 years, and it has received so many criticisms already regarding how the foreign investment has been conducted. And this is not just Serbia, but also Pakistan, Sri Lanka. So all this reputational repercussion has already cost China quite a lot. So just really judging by the tones from Beijing, and you perhaps would perceive immediate, that so-called pandemic diplomacy that happened in Serbia, but that only lasted for about 2 months. And I think really after the National People's Congress in the beginning, by the end of May, and I think Beijing made its head very clear. And this perhaps is time for China to scale back and not really to play a bigger role in the region which China is perhaps really less familiar with. I mean, like, for example, the Western Balkans. And also just look at the China-EU relations in general. It's soaring. The two sides could not even come up with a joint statement as the summit had been held last week. So what I'm arguing here, at the end of the day, let's not hope that China will be able to fill that vacuum left by the United States within the Balkans. But what you expect is you're expecting it will be much harder to borrow the money from the Chinese state-owned banks and also from the Chinese development agencies, because the criteria has not been changing. And that's really the direction from Xi Jinping.
Thank you. Now I have a question. I'm not sure who would like to take this question. The question is coming from Arba Becker, and Arba asks, do you think that Serbia will apologize for the genocide in Kosovo, and whether you think that Serbian policy towards Kosovo will change and Kosovan independence will be accepted? So it's a thorny issue, perhaps. Bogdan, do you have any thoughts on that? Or Sena? Sorry, Sena's.
So you can go first if you like.
I think you can go first, Bogdan.
All right. So, Serbia will apologize for the genocide in Kosovo. I guess it's a complicated question that refers to the so-called transitional justice issue. Officially, the Serbian government has already apologized for Srebrenica and for other similar atrocities or genocide committed by the members of its society or nation. Kosovo, because of the whole process of Kosovo gaining the independence, I guess might be quite difficult for any Serbian government to officially apologize for that war, for the atrocities committed in Kosovo. I think that the first condition for having such debate is the regulation or regulation of the relations between Kosovo, between Pristina and Belgrade. So first we have to stabilize the relations, create some space for the dialogue, for equal dialogue, and which may also kind of be connected to the recognition of Kosovo in this or the other way. But only afterwards, I guess, the genuine and honest discussion on such sensitive issue would be possible. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And I think Sena would like to come in also.
Well, under the current circumstances, even if that apology came in the format as it was when it was Boris Tadic, the former president, apologizing for Srebrenica, it wouldn't be sincere for sure, because there's hardly any political or social debate within Serbia on what has been happening in 1998, 1999 for certainly. So this is, I think, the prerequisite for making such move, and it's also the precondition for resolving the bilateral dispute. If we don't face with the past in a really like open and sincere manner, and if there's no political backing for such facing of the past from both sides, from Kosovo and Serbian political elites, there won't be any long-term solution to this issue, nor the genuine apology for war crimes perpetrated.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to move on to another question from Clay Cash from NATO, and this is for Cherry. The question is there any indication that China has used its economic penetration in the Balkans to leverage its political objectives, aside from the One China policy?
Well, I think there are many political initiatives that China has in mind. I mean, basically what China has been practiced from the Belt and Road Initiative, this not just apply for Serbia, but apply for many other countries as well, is to use that China's extensive financial resources to achieve its political means. So obviously to keep one China rule is one thing, to keep, to eliminate Taiwan's diplomatic partner as few as possible around the world. So that's priority number one. But priority number two, it is on this Belt and Road Initiative is how to using that China's economic capability in order to establish something that this recipient country will develop that sense of dependency, political dependency, and also economic dependency towards China. And I think China is playing a longer game in here. Having said that, China, even though by playing a longer game, but I don't think necessarily that Belt and Road Initiative has been a quite successful win for China as such at all. I mean, just really judging by a significant amount of backlashes from European Union member states and also from several other, like in Sri Lanka and Pakistan. And I don't think the BRI has really achieved the end result as what Chinese leadership intended. But at the end of the day, because of the COVID-19 scenario, somehow China managed to project that narrative to Serbia, which is, this is the country, the rising power, be able to helping a country which have its own regional ambition at the same time. So I think apart from the Taiwan issue, and I think what China is essentially trying to do is trying to establish its own standards and rules on global governance, and to let as many countries as possible would agree China's practice on that rule and widely use that rules and standards on global governance and international organizations. So it's way of past dependency, like what the European Union have done in the past. But China has done it in a very unsophisticated manner. China has done it through getting on well with the elites, like for example in Serbian government. But I'm not sure really that whether has been that sense of economic benefit would be largely benefited towards the ordinary population on the ground. And that's another open question.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're running quite low on time, so I just have one final question, which has come in from Simon Thomas at the RCDS. He asks, how would the panel evaluate Turkey's engagement in the Western Balkans? Is Turkey trying to compete with other geostrategic players? I think Bogdan looks poised to come in on this one. Bogdan?
Well, as far as I know, Turkey is mostly involved in Bosnia, although the position or the strategy of Turkey is rather to operate as a country that brings all parties, all actors together. I mean, the Balkan countries, Balkan actors, and to operate as some sort of mediator between those parties. So, for instance, there is of course there are certain economic incentives provided by Turkey, like the development of road infrastructure. We have the case in the construction of the highway in Bosnia that is, I think, goes through Republika Srpska, the Federation, and Serbia, where we have the cooperation between three entities: Serbia, Republika Srpska, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So I would say that, but on the other hand, that Turkey is not that present like in other spheres of socioeconomic life or political life. Rather, it has no political leverage. Has this, as I said, much more involved in Bosnia, maybe also culturally and socially. But this is due to the fact that as an Islamic country where the prevailing religion Islam somehow can communicate easier with Bosniaks. And but as a matter of fact, I don't see any other areas of Turkey's involvement in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think anyone else. Oh, I think Sena, would you like to come in on this?
I can just briefly come in. Well, except for this cultural influence that Turkey exercises in the region with this very distinguished Ottoman heritage. It also acts very opportunistically when it comes to economic opportunities. So Erdogan really gets along well with Vučić, and all the economic investments made in Serbia are, in a way, a proof that it also, acts as, is seeking for its, economic opportunities in the region. And there is this prevailing theory which stems from the former foreign minister Ahmet Davutoglu, about this green transversal of Turkey, and the way in which it wants to project its influence in the region is to connect through infrastructure all these, let's say, points in the Western Balkans where it is culturally influential. So the Sandžak region in Serbia, Montenegro also Sandžak region, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Albania and Macedonia, and so on and so forth. And that's why it also seeks for economic opportunities in these areas as well. That's one of the theories which in a way has so far lived up to the practice, I would say. But in general, its influence is minor compared to other global actors that we have discussed today.
Thank you. Now, I know that we've received more questions than we have time to answer. So I'm going to try to combine asking each of you to give a brief concluding remark on what we've discussed, and also incorporating a quick question, if I may. So if we could start with Cherry, there's been a question that's come in for you, which is, how far does China see the EU as a potential operational partner for co-investing in the Western Balkans, so as to reassure both EU members and players in the region? So the idea that it could be a win-win situation. So if you could answer that and also give us your sort of concluding thoughts on the discussion.
Sure. I think what we're experiencing so far is China, Beijing and Brussels are now negotiating this bilateral investment agreement. But there has been a major disagreement between the two sides, mostly on state-owned company subsidies and also on environmental and labor standards. As soon as the two sides could overcome that hurdle, I mean, I don't know how and when, and then perhaps we would foresee a joint investment between China and the European Union. I mean, EIB, European Investment Bank, already made a joint fund to investing on infrastructures with the EU, together with China's Silk Road Fund, which is one of China's national wealth funds. So the prospect's there. But the trouble is, at the end of the day, European Union will have to accept China as it is, as being a one-party country that by no way is going to share the same value as the European Union cherish at the end of the day. So I think the politics is really the art of visible. There's always a direction to travel between reality and the perception. And whether the two sides will be able to square that circle, I really don't see that would happen in post-COVID-19 world.
Thank you. And just to add to that question came in from Michael McClay of the Club of Three. So that's an interesting final point to rest on from the Chinese perspective, which is that China's political system is unlikely to change. And we've discussed the rather poor chances of change in Serbia. So perhaps I could pass over to Sena to give some final thoughts on the European Union perspective on the Western Balkans.
Sure. Well, there's been a lot of talk today about the soft power of the EU as well as the hard power, like to what extent is it able to broker major deals or to be the initiator of, for example, resolving Serbia-Kosovo dispute or investing itself in Bosnia and Herzegovina and so on. Here I would just add on this soft power the EU still has in the region, despite its inability to be a transformative power of the region at the moment. The region and its citizens crave for living in fully functional democracies and societies. This is what all public opinion polls show. So even though its communication policy is very flawed, as Cherry has also mentioned, the opinion polls like claiming to what extent there's this false perception of who is the major donor in the region and in Serbia in particular and so on. It does have this capital of being an attractive norm-based actor whose model and these main most developed member states represent a role model for our citizens where they want to live in. So to wrap up, if it wants to become a greater player in the region, it does have to find ways to offer more political commitment to the region and more credible, what they say in this jargon, credible membership perspective that will motivate on the other side the political elites to invest themselves in politically costly reforms. Otherwise, unfortunately, the region does not have this internal strength or drive from the bottom up, from grassroots, to do anything, because the media is captured, you know, their weak institutions and so on. So this vicious circle needs to be broken, and this commitment for EU membership, to me, even though it's very flawed and there is many space for improvement, still seems to be the best way to, you know, move this region forward from this stalemate it is in.
Thank you. I'd just like to, again, try to shoehorn another question into Maxim's final thoughts on this discussion. I'm going to hugely paraphrase a question that's come in from Vsevolod Samokvalov. I apologize for mispronouncing your name. He's asked about your point that the Russian interest in the Balkans is diminishing, and points to several examples of propaganda campaigns in the region. So, Maxim, if you could offer us your final thoughts on this conversation, but also respond to the question about Russians continuing soft power, should we say, exercises in the region.
Okay, yeah, I'd say that Russia's best days in the region are already in the past, and we shouldn't expect Russia really some new wave of Russia's activity in the region, just because current Russian leadership faces so many challenges at home that it's highly unlikely to invest in the third-rate priorities abroad. Now the Kremlin faces the post-pandemic economic crisis, falling oil prices, its problems with political legitimacy. I can hardly imagine how Balkans can fit into this picture, taking into account how limited Russian resources has grown. Yes, Russia, like one of the main aims of Russian foreign policy is to project the image of world power. And Balkans are very nice place to do that, because there is some historical connections, there is cultural ties and all this stuff. So it's easy to organize a high-profile propaganda campaign, but it's just gestures. You don't have any substance in this, and it won't appear anytime soon.
Thank you very much. And finally, I'd like to hand over to Bogdan to give his final perspective on our discussion.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you all for, as I said, again, joining us today, for sharing your views, sharing your perspectives on this, on the issue of external powers involvement in the region. So what I can say is that the impact or the influence of the external actors in the region will continue, but it will continue in the forms that will be shaped by the hegemonic actor. So I'll basically stick to my argument on the EU as the most powerful actor in the region that defines the rules. So I also believe that along with this EU integration process, probably the EU integration process in the region, in the case of Serbia, will continue again. Will be very different than in case of other countries like Croatia or Hungary that joined the EU in 2004, because it's also the set of problems that the EU is facing in the region is different in the case of Serbia. So for now, we can be sure that most of the efforts, most of the activities will be focused on solving the Kosovo issue, but also the issue of Bosnia and Herzegovina's future political system. I personally believe that this comes together. We cannot separate the discussion on the Kosovo-Pristina-Belgrade relations from the status, from the issue of political system in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the position of Serbian replica srpska in that system, because that would only bring the tangible results for the whole region and will eventually stabilize it. And I think that's only if we solve these things in the first place, probably can start speaking about discussing the issue of democracy and rule of law in the region. I know this sounds quite cynical, and this is a very kind of pragmatic or realpolitik approach, but this is just my prediction, and that's how I perceive the things at the moment. So I wouldn't have any high expectations towards the EU and so EU exercising its leverage in order to introduce to push the government, the local government in that way to introduce some more democratic standards. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Bogdan. Now, just before we finish our discussion, we're very fortunate to be joined by the LSE Ideas Director, Professor Christopher Coker, who is a Professor of International Relations. And I'd just like to invite him to give some final thoughts on behalf of the Ratio Forum programme and the LSE Ideas, and just draw on his expertise to give us further context and a nice concluding moment. Christopher, are you able to join us?
Well, I'm not sure I can give you a nice concluding moment, Megan, but I will try to give you some conclusions that I've drawn from this interesting discussion. I'd like to thank our speakers anyway on behalf of LSE Ideas and the Ratio Foundation. We came together about 2 years ago to put together a program, of which this is part, the 2020 program. And we started off with an interest in Central Europe, and we've extended as far north as Poland, and now we're in the Balkans. So I think our expansion has complemented that, perhaps, of China, if not Russia, from what we've just heard. So what do I conclude from today's discussion? Just a few points very, very quickly. Back in 1999, during the Kosovo War, there were only 3 players in the Western Balkans: the European Union, the United States, and Russia. Today, there are considerably more, and I'm glad that the question of Turkey's role, and Qatar's role as well, should be brought up. So it's a complex geopolitical situation, much more so than, say, 10 or 15 years ago. But I wondered whether we should be talking about geopolitics so much as geoeconomics or geoculture, because from what I've gathered today, there is a cultural challenge. There's a cultural challenge to Russia, because if its influence is going to diminish in this region, at the moment, of course, Serbia is locked into a dialogue with Russia because of Kosovo, but once the Kosovo issue is, if it is, resolved in 6 months' time at the UN, we'll have to see what happens there. But it's certainly a cultural issue for the European Union, because it's a challenge to what one of our speakers calls its transformative power. As democracy stalls in the region, particularly in Serbia, it's a challenge to the normative regime that it's tried to establish since the mid-1990s in this area. And that brings me finally to China, which is not just, I think, an economic challenge, though it is, but it's what the EU calls a systemic challenge. That's the term it used last year. And it's a systemic challenge because if it's all about economics and it's not about norms and values, then that's going to change, I think, the geopolitical mix quite significantly. And there will be many members of the European Union, Hungary for one, possibly Italy again, that may want the right to choose the relationships they have with countries like China and not have that right determined by Brussels in whatever form. So there's a lot to play for, and I think it's a fast changing situation. So that's what I've learned today, Megan, and I think it's been a very worthwhile discussion. I did receive a message from Nikolai asking me to say something. Unfortunately, on my smartphone, I can't read messages. I can read that I've received them, but I can't actually read them. So Nikolai, I don't know whether you wish to come in at this moment or not, but it's over to you, Megan.
Thank you. I don't know if we're able to give access to Nikolai. It's a silence, so
possibly not.
Perhaps not. Well, I apologise, and thank you for, quite right, not a nice but a very insightful concluding remark. Thank you very much, Professor Coker, for that. So it just falls to me to say thank you very much to all of our panelists, to Bogdan, Sena, Maxim and Cherry. It's been a great pleasure listening to you all, and I'm sure the audience, as well as myself, enjoyed it a great deal. So thank you on behalf of the Ratio Forum, which this event is part of, and LSE Ideas. And I'd like to ask all our audience members if you could complete the survey when you leave this meeting. We'd appreciate that a great deal. Also, we have another event in our series coming up on Monday, the 27th of July, that will be looking at migration in the Central and Eastern European region, particularly returning migration. So please do join us for that. So please check in on our website, LSE Ideas, and on the Ratsu Forum website, ratsuforum.com. And we hope to see you at another event very soon. Thank you very much and goodbye.